The radio woke her at 4:47 in the morning, and Chief Warrant Officer Megan Ellis knew before she even answered it that something had gone badly wrong. "Ellis, you need to get down to the crossing, now." She was already pulling on her boots. 5 nights of relief work had taught her body to move before her mind fully caught up, and by the time Sergeant First Class Danny Ruiz finished the sentence, she was out the tent flap and into air that still smelled like rain. The convoy road ran along the ridge above the river, and from there she could see the flashlights below, small and scattered, moving without any clear pattern. That was the first thing that told her how bad it was. Trained soldiers didn't move like that unless they didn't know yet what they were looking at. She found out when she reached the bank. The bridge, the only bridge, the one that connected 40 miles of flooded farmland and 3 villages to the aid convoys, to the water purification unit, to the insulin that a nurse named Carla Deal had been rationing out by the vial for 2 days, was gone. Not damaged, gone. One of the center pylons had sheared off at the base, and the whole southern span had folded into the river like wet cardboard, girders twisted and half submerged, still groaning faintly as the current pushed against them. On the far bank, in the gray pre-dawn light, she could already see people gathering. Not many yet, but word would travel fast in a place this small, and by full daylight there would be a crowd standing on the wrong side of a river that used to have a bridge across it. "How long ago?" Megan asked. "Best guess, 2 hours," Ruiz said. He was young for a sergeant, competent, and right now he looked like a man who badly wanted someone else to be in charge. "Current took the whole support structure. We got lucky nobody was on it." Megan didn't answer right away. She was doing the math that engineers do without meaning to. Load, span, current speed, what was salvageable, what wasn't. And none of the numbers she was coming up with were good. "Where's Torres?" she asked, meaning her equipment operator. "Checking the truck. It's not looking great, ma'am." That was the second piece of bad news, and she hadn't even gotten to the first one yet. The pontoon bridging truck, the heavy equipment that should have made this whole problem far more manageable, had taken damage 2 days earlier hauling relief supplies through washed-out terrain, and the transmission was giving Torres trouble every time he tried to move it more than a few hundred yards. Megan walked to the edge of the bank and crouched down, studying the wreckage in the weak light. 37 years old, 5 of them spent doing exactly this kind of work, and she still felt the old tightening in her chest that came before every hard decision. The fear that she'd miss something, that she'd trust the wrong instinct at the wrong moment. She'd made that mistake once before, years ago, on a deployment nobody on this crew knew about, and it had cost more than time. She didn't let herself think about it often. She was thinking about it now. "Ma'am," Ruiz's voice pulled her back. "Command's on the line. They want a status." She stood, brushed the mud off her knees, and walked toward the radio truck, already composing what she was going to say, when a second call came through. Not from command, but from the weather station attached to their forward operating base. The meteorologist's voice was flat and professional, the way people get when they've learned that panic doesn't help anyone. "Ma'am, I know you've got your hands full, but you need this now. The system that dropped last night's rain wasn't the main event. There's a larger front behind it, moving faster than the earlier models had it. Current projection puts it over your position in approximately 36 hours. And ma'am, this one's bigger." Megan stood very still for a moment, the radio handset warm against her palm, the sound of the river behind her louder than it should have been. 36 hours. Not to patch something together, not to make do until real equipment arrived. 36 hours to put a functioning crossing back over that river, one strong enough to move people and supplies, before a storm came through that would very likely finish whatever the first flood had started, and turn temporary damage into a problem that would take weeks, not hours, to fix. She looked across the water at the small cluster of people already waiting on the far side, and then down at her own hands, and she let herself have exactly 3 seconds to feel the size of what she was facing. Then she keyed the radio. "Copy that," she said. I need everyone at the crossing site in 15 minutes. Full assessment. We're not waiting on daylight. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, Megan had 11 soldiers standing in a loose half-circle around a folding table, a hand-drawn sketch of the river crossing weighted down with a socket wrench, and a much clearer picture of exactly how much trouble they were in. "Pontoon truck's out," Torres said first, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had stopped being useful for that purpose an hour ago. "Transmission slipping bad. I can maybe get it to limp another mile if I baby it, but I'm not putting load-bearing weight behind that engine. Not for something like this." Megan had expected that answer, but hearing it confirmed still landed heavy. The pontoon system was the fast, tested, reliable way to bridge a gap this size. Without it, she was down to whatever the team could build with hand tools, salvaged lumber, cabling, and the 2 Humvees they had on site. "What about the reserve bridging unit out of Fort Drummond?" asked Specialist Yates, one of the newer soldiers, hopeful in the way people are when they haven't yet learned how slow the Army can move when it wants to. 16 hours out, best case," Megan said. "That's if the roads hold, which after last night, I wouldn't bet on." Sergeant Ruiz shifted his weight. He hadn't said much since the riverbank, but she could see him working up to it now. "Ma'am, with respect, if support's 16 hours out, and we've got 36 before the storm hits, maybe the smart move is to wait. Stabilize what we can on this side, get people fed and hydrated, and let the unit with the real equipment handle the rebuild when they get here. We don't have the gear to do this right." It was a reasonable thing to say. It was, in fact, exactly what the manual would tell her to do: wait for proper equipment rather than improvise a load-bearing structure in the field. 6 months ago, she might have agreed with him. But 6 months ago, she hadn't been standing at a river with insulin running low on the other side and a storm front closing the window to nothing. "If they get here in 16 hours, Megan said, "and it takes them another 10 to set up and cross-check the pontoon system on wet ground, we're looking at 26 hours minimum before the first delivery makes it across. That leaves us a 10-hour cushion before the storm, if nothing goes wrong. Nothing ever goes exactly right." Nobody argued with that. "So we're not waiting," she went on. "We're building something now, out of what we've got, and we're building it strong enough to hold until the real bridge crew arrives to either reinforce it or replace it properly. I want a timber and cable suspension design. Not pretty, not permanent, but rated to carry foot traffic and light vehicle loads if we brace it right." Ruiz's jaw tightened, but he didn't push back further, which she appreciated more than she let on. Yates looked between them, unsure whether he'd just watched a disagreement or a decision. "I've seen this design work in training," Megan said, and made herself keep her voice even, because the next part was true, and she wasn't going to hide it from them. "I've never built it under a live deadline, in the field, with a storm coming. I want that said out loud so nobody here is following me blind. If any of you sees a problem with the load calculations as we go, I want to hear it. Immediately, not after." That seemed to settle something in the group, more than false confidence would have. She'd learned that about soldiers a long time ago. They could handle being scared. What wore them down was being lied to about the size of the risk. She split the 11 of them into 2 rotating shifts of roughly 5 and 6, staggered 6 hours apart, so no one would be awake and working the entire 36-hour window. Fatigue killed people on jobs like this as surely as bad engineering did, and she'd watched it happen once before, which was a memory she didn't examine too closely in front of her team. "Ruiz, you've got first shift with me. Torres, get what cabling and hardware you can strip from the damaged pontoon rig. We'll use what's salvageable. Yates, I want every length of usable timber inventoried in the next 20 minutes. The soldiers scattered to their tasks with the particular quiet efficiency of people who'd rather be doing something than standing still with bad news. Megan stayed by the table a moment longer, looking at her own sketch, tracing the span with one finger, running the numbers again in her head, even though she'd already run them twice. By the time the first supports went into the ground, the morning light had gone strange and yellow-gray, the kind of sky that made old soldiers glance up without meaning to. Somewhere behind that color, 40 miles out and closing. The second storm was already gathering itself. Megan picked up a shovel and started digging alongside her soldiers, because there wasn't a version of the next 36 hours where she got to stand back and only give orders. By midnight, the crossing site looked less like a construction project and more like a small, exhausted village, built entirely out of urgency. Floodlights ran off a generator that coughed every few minutes like it resented being asked to work this hard. Cable spools sat in muddy rows. Somewhere in the dark, someone was hammering, and the sound carried strangely over the water. Megan had been awake for 19 hours straight, and she could feel it in her hands. A fine tremor she kept hidden by keeping them busy. They'd made real progress. Both support towers on the near bank were up and braced. The first cable run had been strung across the gap using a line-throwing rig Torres had rigged from spare parts, and now the work was in the delicate, dangerous middle stage, tensioning the main support cables so the deck sections could be hung between them. That was where it went wrong. "Cable!" someone shouted, and the word had barely left his mouth before the sound came. A sharp metallic crack, like a rifle shot, followed by a whipping noise that made every soldier on the site instinctively drop. Megan was moving before she'd fully processed what happened. A support cable had snapped under tension near the near side anchor, and the recoil had caught Specialist Yates across the shoulder and knocked him hard into one of the timber uprights. He was on the ground when she reached him, conscious, swearing through his teeth, one arm held wrong against his body. "Don't move him yet," she said, dropping to a crouch. "Yates, look at me. Where's it hurt?" "Shoulder," he managed. "Think it's dislocated, not broken. I've had it happen before back home. Football." The relief that ran through her at not hearing the word broken was immediately replaced by a colder thought, one she couldn't afford to ignore. The cable hadn't failed randomly. Something in her tension calculations, or in the anchor point itself, had let go under a load it should have handled. "Ruiz, get the corpsman. Torres, I want that anchor point inspected before anyone touches another cable." She kept her voice level, because the rest of the team was watching her more closely than they were watching Yates right now. And level was what they needed to see. It was while the corpsman was working on Yates's shoulder, a controlled reduction that made the young specialist go pale and silent for a few seconds, that a set of headlights swung down the access road, and a Humvee that didn't belong to her unit pulled up at the edge of the site. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove climbed out before the engine had fully stopped. Megan recognized the name off his uniform before she recognized the face, and neither one improved her mood. He commanded a battalion 2 sectors over, and she'd heard he had a reputation for showing up exactly when things were going badly and having opinions about it. Chief Warrant Officer Ellis. He didn't return her salute so much as acknowledge it had happened. "I got word you're running an unauthorized bridging design on a civilian corridor." "And I got word somebody just got hurt doing it. Sir, we assessed the equipment failure and reserve unit ETA and determined a temporary structure was the only option to meet the storm timeline. You determined." Hargrove looked past her at the injured soldier being helped toward the medical tent, then at the half-finished span disappearing into darkness over the water. "This isn't a certified field design, Chief. If that whole structure comes down with people or vehicles on it, that's not a training exercise anymore." "No, sir, it's not." She kept her voice steady, though something in her chest had gone tight and cold. "It's also not certified for us to leave a civilian population cut off from medical resupply for 4 more days while we wait on equipment that may not make it here in time either." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Somewhere behind them, the generator coughed again. "I want your calculations," Hargrove finally said. "Tonight. And I want to know why a cable just failed on your watch." "Yes, sir." Megan meant it, and not only because he outranked her. She wanted to know that too. Before he'd finished writing down whatever conclusion he'd already half-formed, Ruiz jogged over from the radio truck, and one look at his face told her there was more coming. "Ma'am, village elder on the far side got a runner across the old footbridge upstream. Barely holding, apparently. Nobody wants to trust it with more than one person at a time. He says they've got 6 elderly residents and 4 children who need to be moved before the storm. No shelter over there strong enough to survive it. 6 more hours added to the invisible weight already sitting on her shoulders. Not just materials and time now, but people who couldn't be asked to wait. Copy. We'll prioritize their crossing the moment the deck sections are load rated, she said, hoping she sounded more certain than she felt. She left Hargrove with a promise to bring him the calculations within the hour and walked back toward the generator lights, pulling her design notebook from her jacket. She needed to know why that cable had failed before she strung a single foot of additional line. She sat on an overturned equipment crate, spread the notebook across her knee, and started reworking the tension figures from scratch, checking them against the anchor specs Torres had radioed over. The first pass matched her earlier numbers. She frowned and ran it again, slower this time, accounting for the actual soil composition at the anchor point instead of the standard assumption she'd used under time pressure that morning. The second time, the number came out wrong. Not wrong by a small margin. Wrong by enough that the anchor system as designed would not reliably hold the tension needed once the deck sections and their live load were factored in. Not on soil this saturated. Not after last night's flood had turned the near bank into something closer to wet clay than solid ground. Megan sat very still, staring at the number, while behind her the sound of hammers and voices went on as if nothing had just changed. She had a structural flaw in a bridge her team was already building, a battalion commander waiting for the same calculations she now knew were compromised, a wounded soldier in the medical tent, 10 civilians waiting to cross a river that wasn't finished being a bridge yet, and somewhere out past the dark tree line, a storm that had no intention of waiting for her to work it out. Megan didn't move for almost a full minute. Around her the site kept working, hammers, voices, the generator's uneven cough, while she sat with a number in her notebook that meant everything they'd built since dawn was standing on ground that wouldn't hold it. She thought about waking Torres, about calling Hargrove over immediately, about a dozen versions of the next hour. What she kept coming back to was the same cold, familiar fear she'd carried since a deployment years ago that nobody on this crew knew about. The fear of trusting her own read on a situation over the safer, more cautious call. Last time, she'd deferred. She'd waited for confirmation that never came in time, and a soldier under her command had paid for the delay. She'd promised herself after that she would never again let caution stand in for cowardice. But she also wasn't going to let this become the opposite mistake, recklessness dressed up as courage. She found Torres first. The near side anchor's compromised, she told him quietly, so the words wouldn't carry to the rest of the crew before she had a plan to put behind them. Soil's too saturated to hold the tension we need at that point. Torres's face went through the same brief calculation hers had. We move the anchor. Can't. Not enough usable ground before the slope drops off. But there's a way to redistribute the load instead of relying on a single deep anchor. Split tension across 2 shallower points, tied back to the old bridge foundation footing that's still intact on this side. She'd seen the technique once, in a training exercise years ago, on dry ground, under no real pressure at all. It should work. I haven't done it live. Should, Torres repeated, not unkindly. Should, she agreed. She brought the revised plan to Hargrove 10 minutes later, along with the honest account of what had gone wrong and why. He read through her notes for a long moment, and she watched him do the math the way career officers did, measuring risk against consequence, procedure against reality. You're telling me, he said slowly, that your fix for an anchor failure is a technique you've never actually tested under load. Yes, sir. And your alternative? Wait for the reserve unit, except we don't get vehicle or foot traffic across before the storm, and tell the families on the far side that help isn't coming until conditions clear. Possibly days. Hargrove didn't answer right away. Somewhere out past the ridge, thunder rolled. Distant, but no longer abstract. If you do this, he finally said, I want to know exactly how you plan to confirm the fix holds before a single soldier or civilian sets foot on that deck. That was the question she'd already been asking herself, and there was only one honest answer. I test it myself first. Ruiz, who'd come up beside them without her noticing, went still. "Ma'am, I designed the fix. I'm not sending someone else out onto a structure I'm not fully certain of." She kept her voice even, though her pulse wasn't cooperating. If it fails with the person who made the call. Nobody in her chain of command could order her not to. It wasn't reckless bravado. It was the plainest form of the responsibility she'd spent 5 years building toward, the kind she'd once let slip through her hands when it mattered most. The reinforced anchor points went in over the next 40 minutes, cabling redistributed exactly as she'd sketched it, soldiers moving with the particular focus of people who understood, without being told twice, how much was riding on the next half hour. Rain had started, light but steady, the kind that told you heavier rain wasn't far behind. When it was ready, Megan clipped into a safety line more out of procedure than real hope it would matter if the whole structure gave way, and walked out onto the deck. The first steps were the hardest. That strange, suspended feeling of trusting your own calculations with your body instead of just your notebook. The timber flexed under her weight, cables humming faintly with the tension shift. She kept walking, steady, deliberate, feeling for any give in the structure that shouldn't be there. Halfway across, she stopped and made herself stand still, letting her full weight settle, listening. The bridge held. She walked the rest of the way to the far bank in the rain, and when she turned around to make her way back, she found she was breathing normally again for the first time in hours. Ruiz was waiting when she stepped off onto solid ground, hand already extended to help her over the last uneven section, an expression on his face that hadn't been there earlier that night. Not quite apology, but something close to it. "I was wrong to push back this morning," he said. "Wanted you to know that." "You weren't wrong to ask the question," Megan said, meaning it. "That's your job too." Behind them, Hargrove was already on the radio, redirecting the evacuation team toward the crossing. Within minutes, the first small group started across, an elderly woman leaning on her son's arm, 2 children clutching a soldier's hands on either side, moving slow and careful over a bridge that had been standing, in its current form, for less than an hour. Lightning lit the ridge behind them, closer now than it had been at midnight, and Megan stood at the edge of the deck counting heads as they crossed, feeling something in her chest finally start to loosen that had been wound tight since 4:47 that morning. The last of the elderly residents and children made it across just before 3 a.m., and by then the rain had thickened into something with real weight behind it, the wind starting to push sideways in short, testing gusts that Megan recognized as a preview of what was still to come. There was no time to feel relief. The evacuation had bought them a few hours, not victory. The bridge still needed reinforcement to handle the vehicle loads that would carry medical supplies and equipment across once the storm passed, and the storm itself hadn't arrived yet. Deck sections on the southern half still need cross-bracing, Megan told the second shift as they came on, faces still soft with interrupted sleep. "We've got maybe 6 hours before this front is on top of us. I want every connection point checked twice, not once." They worked through the worst of the night in shifts of exhausted, focused effort, headlamps cutting through rain that came harder with every passing hour. Torres coaxed one more useful haul out of the damaged truck, dragging the last of the heavy timber into position before the transmission finally gave out for good, and he stood over it afterward with the particular tenderness people reserve for equipment that's failed them honorably. Around 5 a.m., the wind found real strength, and the first serious gusts hit the site hard enough to send loose tarps snapping like gunfire. Megan called the last of the crew back off the structure itself, keeping only what work could be done from solid ground, and then there was nothing left to do but wait and watch. The storm came through hard for almost 3 hours. Rain drove sideways. The generator finally died and stayed dead, leaving them to work by headlamp and instinct. Twice, Megan walked as close to the bank as she dared, watching the water rise against the new support towers, watching the cables hold their tension against gusts that made the whole structure hum with strain. It held. By the time gray daylight came back, real daylight, not the strange yellow warning light of the morning before. The worst of the front had pushed through, leaving behind steady rain and a river running high, but no longer rising. The bridge stood, battered, improvised, ugly in the way only something built out of desperation and salvaged parts could be, but standing. The first relief truck crossed at 8:40 that morning, moving slow, tires easing over deck sections that flexed but held, carrying insulin and water purification tablets toward villages that had spent 36 hours wondering if help would come in time. Megan watched it go, standing at the near side anchor with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago without her noticing. Hargrove came to stand beside her, watching the truck reach the far bank without comment for a while. "I've seen a lot of field engineers make the safe call when the situation called for something else," he finally said. "And I've seen a few make the reckless call and get lucky. What you did last night wasn't either one." He paused. "I'll be noting that in my report, for whatever that's worth." "It's worth something, sir," Megan said, and meant it, though she found she didn't need his approval the way she might have expected to. Something about the last 36 hours had settled a question she'd been carrying much longer than that. Ruiz found her a little later, after the second and third relief trucks had crossed without incident, after the corpsman had confirmed Yates's shoulder would heal clean with a few weeks of care, after the adrenaline of the night had finally started to drain out of everyone's shoulders at once, leaving pure exhaustion behind. "Reserve unit radioed," he said. "Says they're 20 minutes out. Guess they'll be reinforcing a bridge that's already up." "Guess so," Megan said, and there was no bitterness in it. Only the tired satisfaction of someone who'd needed the job done more than she'd needed credit for doing it. "For what it's worth," Ruiz added, "I'd follow you into the next one of these without asking questions first." "Ask the questions anyway," Megan said. "Just don't expect me to always have a clean answer." He almost smiled at that, and it struck her as the truest exchange they'd had in the whole 36 hours. She walked the length of the bridge one more time before the reserve crew arrived to begin the real reinforcement work, feeling the deck under her boots. Solid now in a way it hadn't been 12 hours earlier when she'd walked it the first time, not knowing for certain it would hold. On the far bank, she could see the village slowly waking into a normal morning, smoke rising from cooking fires, a line already forming near the aid distribution point. Children who'd crossed in the dark the night before now running along the bank in daylight as if nothing unusual had happened at all, which, for them, was exactly the point. Megan stood there a while longer, coffee finally gone cold all the way through, and let herself feel something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not relief exactly, and not pride either, but something steadier than both. The quiet certainty that when it had mattered most, she had trusted herself, and it had been enough. Behind her, the reserve convoy's engines came into earshot, and ahead of her, the river kept moving past the bridge that had, against every reasonable expectation, held. Chief Warrant Officer Megan Ellis never set out to be remembered. She just did the job in front of her, one hard decision at a time, until a river that should have kept thousands of people isolated for days instead carried help across in 36 hours. That's the kind of courage that rarely makes headlines. The quiet, exhausting kind, built out of long nights and second-guessed calculations and the willingness to be the first one to test whether your own work will hold. Thank you for watching Megan's story to the end. If it moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are so many more stories like hers still waiting to be told. See you in the next story.